So there's been something that's been on my mind. Our house now is about 90% completed, and as we inch ever closer to that finish line, I've honestly had a part-time job as a project coordinator, working with all of the different subcontractors and craftsmen in getting this house finished. And I have to say, with everyone we've worked with on this project, they've been nothing short of incredibly professional and extremely well-skilled. And I can't help but wonder if that's due, at least in part, to the fact that here in Germany, trade jobs or vocational education is highly respected. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mean this as any way in any form of disrespect to American trade workers, but I do think that it is extremely surprising that in contrast to the high number of German tradesmen and vocational education opportunities, in the United States, less than 5% of young workers train as apprentices. And this lack of interest in trade jobs isn't just something that I've been noticing as part of American culture. It's something that's recently been talked about a lot in American news and media. So all of this had me wondering, could Germany's program for vocational education and training be a model for the United States? So buckle up, everyone. This subject is easily one of the most interesting yet complicated topics we've ever covered on this channel. Okay, guys, so before we jump into the ins and outs of vocational training, I think it's important that I first explain, at least generally, how students would even enter into trade jobs in the first place. And as you can imagine, this process is very different between Germany and the United States. So in Germany, there are roughly 8.4 million students attending 33,500 schools. And interestingly, the German federal government doesn't actually regulate the school system. It's actually up to the education ministers in each of the individual federal states to set the curriculum and hire staff. And as you can imagine, this somewhat complicates the formation of uniform guidelines. Nevertheless, common standards do exist. Also, just a disclaimer, I recognize this is a very simplified explanation, but I'm here just to give a foundational understanding. In Germany, all children must attend 4 years of primary school. After the 4th year, students are tested and divided into one of 3 different schools depending on their academic progress and standardized testing. These are Gymnasium, which is for the highest achieving students, Realschule for middle achieving students, or Mittelschule or Hauptschule for the lowest achieving students. Now, each of these lasts from about the 5th to 9th or 10th grade. After the 10th grade, students can go on to get their university qualification called the Abitur, or do apprenticeship and vocational training at the Berufsschule, which includes both practical work at a company and theoretical study in that vocational school. Both of these last, again, from about the 10th to the 12th or 13th grade. Alternatively, students can also stop their education at about the 9th or 10th grade, and this would give them the equivalent of a GED or a high school diploma in the United States. And as you can see from this graphic, traditionally speaking, students that went to gymnasium were on a university track. They would acquire the Abitur, go on to university, and get a white-collar job. In the 2 other schools, students would complete vocational training and then enter into the workforce with a blue-collar job. However, there are various points in these tracks where students do have the opportunity to move around. Quite frankly, these pathways aren't as strict as they used to be. Okay, now let's switch gears here and talk about the education system in the United States. Somewhat similar to Germany, it is actually up to local and state governments to determine their education policy and curriculum. In a few videos now, I've shared with you my research interest in low-income housing. And personally speaking, what makes me so passionate about this subject is because where someone lives in the United States is directly correlated to their opportunities and outcomes later on in life. And you see, in the United States, each school district is administered and financed by the community, along with that district state government. So school districts with a higher socioeconomic level tend to have more resources to their schools. Standards and quality of education consequently vary wildly from state to state town to town, and even district to district. However, in contrast to the German system, the US educational tract is one that's pretty linear. The American public education system begins at kindergarten and progresses directly to the 12th grade, where students achieve either a GED or a high school diploma. Sometimes schools will break up large student bodies into elementary school, middle school, sometimes called a junior high school, and high school. But here, the naming of those schools doesn't really matter. All students follow the same educational track. And in the 11th grade, students will typically take either the ACT or the SAT, which are college entrance exams, that'll then be used in tandem with their high school transcripts to apply to local colleges or other state, public, or private universities. And that's why it's probably not so surprising to our American viewers to learn that according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, 66.2% of all high school graduates will go on to enter into either a 4-year or a 2-year university or college education setting. But here's the thing, American high schools didn't always used to be this way. They weren't always so focused on getting kids to university or to a local college. In fact, as late as 1992, most high schools in the United States offered pretty extensive vocational training. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, 97% of American students who graduated high school in 1992 had completed at least one vocational education course. And the average high school graduate in the US had completed as many as 4 full-year vocational training courses. Now today, although the majority of American high school students will still take about one course that could be considered career prep, a lot has changed. And that's certainly because the majority of US high schools have largely shifted their emphasis to preparing students for college or university. Before that change took place, the average suburban high school had a metal shop, a wood shop, and sometimes even an automotive shop. But with the growing emphasis on preparing students to enter college, the majority of those programs have now been shipped off to vocational or technical high schools that are outside of the traditional public high school. That's why today, if kids want to learn how to fix cars, they have to go seek that out at another institution. Today, students have the option to attend either an area vocational school, which is a regional facility that students can attend part of the day to receive their occupational training, or a full-time vocational high school, which is a school that offers academic studies but focuses on preparing students for work in a particular occupation or industry. However, it is important to note here that between these two vocational school options, they really only enroll about 10% of the American student population. Okay guys, so let's stay on track here and talk a little bit more in depth now about Germany's vocational education training. This is commonly referred to as the dual VET, which stands for Dual Vocational Education and Training Program. So let's explore how this works. Now, students who opt for the dual VET will traditionally split their time between in-class training and on-the-job apprenticeships. They spend 3 to 4 days per week in the classroom learning the fundamentals about a certain industry, such as carpentry or welding, and the rest of the week is spent doing hands-on work at companies that offer apprenticeship programs. All in all, this will take somewhere between 2 to 4 years, depending on the industry that student is interested in pursuing. And the appeal of vocational training in Germany is that upon graduation, employment is nearly all but guaranteed. That could explain why about half of all German students will actually enter into a vocational education training program. And that's in contrast, guys, to what I just mentioned earlier about the US education system, where about 2/3 of American students will enter into college and university, with only 1/3 of them entering into the workforce. And I think it's important to mention here that Germany's education system leads to a highly qualified, skilled, and competent workforce. The Vocational Training Act of 1969, which was amended in 2020, introduced this close alliance between the federal government, the federal states, and companies, with a view to providing young people with training in a nationally recognized occupation, which is then documented accordingly by means of a certificate issued by a competent body. So for example, that would be a chamber of industry and commerce or a chamber of crafts and trades. So in other words, where the American education system largely leaves an 18-year-old with just a high school diploma or a GED, by contrast in Germany, for those students who aren't necessarily pursuing the university track, they graduate high school with a nationally recognized certified occupation from a publicly funded institution. And students in Germany have a pretty broad choice of programs that they can pursue for this occupational or vocational training. All in all, there are currently around 330 occupations requiring formal education in Germany. Employer organizations and trade unions are the drivers when it comes to updating and creating new training regulations and occupational profiles or modernizing further training regulations. So as a result, training and testing and certificates are standardized throughout the entire country of Germany. This ensures that all students receive the exact same education, regardless of their region or the company that they're doing their apprenticeship for. Moreover, employers have trust in these certificates that the workers who come to them looking for a job know exactly what they're supposed to do. And the shared responsibility between government, employers, and trade unions also helps in responding to emerging new challenges, such as digital innovations, which will have an increasing impact on manufacturing and the way that work is organized. Okay, now in this section, I'm going to attempt to answer the question about why trade jobs, just quite frankly, aren't as prevalent in the United States. And the answer is actually quite a complicated one. So for starters, one of the big reasons why vocational education and training is less common in the United States is that US employers are less willing to pay for apprenticeships and on-the-job training. German companies pay 75% of the roughly $19,850 annual cost of each trainee, and the government covers the rest. Now, I should mention, this is converted into US dollars and was from a report by PBS in 2014. So I presume the costs have risen somewhat over time, but I still felt that this was a pretty significant statistic to include because it shows the significant cost sharing between German companies and the federal government in order to provide vocational education and training. Another big issue here is the high job turnover rate in the United States, and why that tends to also mean that employers are less motivated, I guess, to invest in young employees for these apprenticeships that cost them money. While 82% of German employees felt loyal to their employers in 2017, and 37% of workers stayed with their company for more than 7 years, US workers remained with the same employer for a median of only 4.2 years in 2016, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. And notably, employee retention rates are actually the highest in Germany among employees who hold vocational training. But the other issue at play here, guys, is that in the US, there's also an issue of consistency. Whereas American vocational schools vary wildly from state to state, as we mentioned before, vocational education in Germany is highly regulated. And again, guys, vocational training in the United States, by contrast, is far less uniform. Let me give you an example. According to UNESCO in a 2014 report, their World TVET database of the United States of America shows that it is taught in non-parallel subsystems that have limited articulation between them. Referred to broadly in the US as career and technical education, abbreviated CTE, vocational training is provided by high schools, career schools, secondary and post-secondary technical schools, as well as community colleges and universities. Also by private and for-profit institutions, which actually dominate the sector, making up the majority of CTE providers. It's why, according to a report by Atlantic in 2016, every young machinist training anywhere in Germany learns the same skills in the same order on the same timetable as every other machinist. And this is good for apprentices. It guarantees high-quality programs where trainees learn more than one company's methods, making it possible for those who wish to switch jobs later on. But quite frankly, As an American, I find it really difficult to see this level of state control or business labor cooperation being successful in the US. And let me again give you an example to better explain. Plumbers represent a good and rare example of apprenticeship training in the US. Most plumbers learn their trade on the job in 4 to 5 year apprenticeship programs, not in a full-time technical school. Unions and businesses actually offer these apprenticeships, which typically involve around 2,000 hours of paid on-the-job training in tandem with classroom instruction. But the issue is that most states and employers require plumbers to be licensed. But licensing requirements vary pretty significantly from state to state. And even in the same state, it can actually vary from city to city. A plumbing license in New York City, for example, might not actually be transferable to other cities within the state of New York. And again, this is just one example, but it goes to show the pretty significant uphill battle that the American vocational and educational training system would go up against if we were to see any kind of reform. And speaking of this uphill battle, I think now's a really good time to talk a little bit about the stigma that exists in the United States around trade jobs and vocational training in general. According to a number of reports in the United States, really since the passage of the 1944 GI Bill, college has been pushed over vocational education. This college for all narrative has been pushed for decades as the clear pathway to success and stability. Parents in the US kind of tend to worry about their children's future if they don't pursue this pathway. And today, quite frankly, it exists the preconception that it takes a college education to get a good job. More than 85% of 141,189 freshman students surveyed in 2015 by the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, for example, stated that getting a better job was the most important reason to go to college. And here's the thing. I think there are probably millions of very well-intended high school counselors and parents who just kind of tend to see apprenticeships and on-the-job training as sort of a vocational consolation prize. They tend to see these jobs as career pathways that are only meant for the students who couldn't quite make the muster to get that 4-year degree. And in my experience living in Germany, that's incredibly different. From everyone I've spoken to, trade jobs or blue-collar jobs and white-collar jobs that would have typically required a university degree, they're respected on the same level. And unfortunately, like I've mentioned before, in the United States, this push for sending kids to college in the United States has unfortunately also coincided with the removal of vocational education from many American high schools. And the effects of this 1-2 punch has effectively resulted in less students pursuing trade jobs overall and significantly increasing student loan debt in the US. In fact, today, the skills gap is wider than it's ever been. The cost of college tuition has soared faster than the cost of food, energy, real estate, and healthcare. Student loan debt is the second highest consumer debt category in the United States, with more than 44 million borrowers who collectively owe more than 1.5 trillion US dollars. So if I circle back to the question I asked at the very beginning of this video, could Germany's vocational education and training program be a model for the United States? Well, if you ask me personally, maybe. But here's the thing. The problem in the United States is we face a multitude of challenges. For one, having a successful vocational education and training program would mean that we would need to have a cultural shift in the mindset that college is for everyone. And we all know that college in the United States is incredibly expensive, so I don't mean that as like free college for everyone. I mean that as a mindset as a parent that all children should go to college or university, which is kind of the prevailing cultural thought that works in the United States. Because essentially, this would mean that we would need to redefine what a successful career looks like. And that would mean including trade jobs. But the other issue is that for this to be successful in the US, we need to have a much, much stronger industry buy-in and cooperation between industry and the government, which, if you're American, you probably recognize as a pretty tall order. While the US could emulate some parts of the German dual VET, it's important to remember that this is a system which is embedded in the country's unique legal, historical, and cultural context. And given the decentralized nature of the US education system, I'm a bit doubtful that this could be pulled off on a nationwide scale. But perhaps it could be successful on a state level. Okay guys, so if you've made it this far into the video, first, congrats. But second, I wanted to answer the so what question. So why do vocational jobs matter? And here's the thing, whether you love or hate the German education system, can't necessarily argue with their results. Germany has one of the lowest youth unemployment rates in the world. In fact, their rates are half of that of the United States. And like I mentioned earlier, guys, from everyone I've ever spoken to in Germany, whether they were foreigners or native Germans, everyone was always in agreement that trade jobs were on the exact same level respect-wise as a white-collar job. Whether your child was pursuing vocational education or university training, they're both highly respected and something to be proud of. But that's a pretty significant contrast to the United States. As someone who grew up in the US, I feel like I could probably generalize a little bit here by saying that there really is sort of this immense pressure to go to college or university as a high school student. But here's a pretty shocking statistic. Of those 2/3 students who actually go on to a 2 or 4 year college or university, 40% of them never graduate. And at the same time, right now in the US, and probably to some extent here in Germany as well, you can pick up any newspaper and read an article about significant labor shortages. Companies, quite frankly, just can't find the workers to fill the need for skilled trade jobs. So at this point in the video, I think it's a good time for me to ask you a question. If you're someone who went through vocational training or currently holds a trade job, what was the education experience like for you? Again, would love to hear from people here in Germany as well as in the US and in other countries. I think this emphasis on vocational education is so incredibly fascinating, and I think that we could have a really cool discussion on just what the differences are around the world. But because this video is also a comparison of the US and German system, if you're a German person watching this video, what advice would you give to Americans if they were to pursue this vocational education reform? What steps do you think they would need to take for it to be successful? Please let me know down in the comment section below. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed today's content, we would love it if you hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from the Black Forest family, hit that subscribe button. So, until next time, tschüss!
Yeah, you're gonna have a real good time, aren't you? Yeah. What do you think, bud? You like your room? Miles. Thanks, off,